welcome back. In this module, we are going to go into even more detail with group by. Let's take a look at our outline. So this module is broken up into 3 parts. The first part is practice, 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 and I'm going to go through several different examples so that you can get a feel for how the group by works. That video is going to take about 17 minutes. The second part is we are going to break down how to change a business question into a group by statement. This one's also going to take 14 minutes, and I know I promised you that each one of these modules could be done in 30 minutes in a day or less. This one, I really felt like the Think Like an Analyst is really important in setting you up for success so that you can do the group bys better, so that's a little extra content this time. We'll wrap up this module with giving you an opportunity to practice your own group bys, and that's the group by do it yourself. And then that will take about 14 minutes as well. Let's not waste any more time. Let's jump right into our practice, practice, practice module. For this lesson, I'm going to run through a bunch of different examples, finding the average, total, highest, and lowest tips for our group by for different dimensions. So first we're going to look at all of our trips, trips by vendor IDs, all of our trips in February, and then all trips for each day in March. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I think the best way to learn group by is to just keep seeing examples of it and seeing, oh, when I group by this, what does it look like? What does it look like when I do this, when I add a where statement? And so it really is just by practice and continuing to see it that it's really going to set in. If you try to think of it too conceptually, I think it can get a little confusing. So we're going to run through these really quickly, go through them, and then we'll meet back in our following lesson to kind of debrief and break down the business questions a little more. Let's get started. So we're tasked with finding the average, total, highest, and lowest tips for the following categories. First, we want to find it for all trips by vendor ID, all trips in February, and all trips for each day in March. Let's get started. First thing that I always like to do is look at my data. So I hit Control click, and here we go. We have our schema, and we'll preview it. So we're looking at vendor ID, okay? And we also want to look at tips. So I just like to see what it looks like. Okay, so we have the fair amount, extra, MTA tax, and then tip amount. All right, so for all trips, this is going to be really easy. We're going to type in select, and what do we want to know? We want to know the average of tip amount as average tips. We want to know the total. I want to hear total, I'm going to think sum. So I want to sum up all of our tips as total tips. I want the highest or the maximum of the tip amount as tip amount. And the lowest, that's going to be min. Tip amount as, I should have called this max tip. Min tip from my data. And let's close this. Now you're going to question, why don't I have the group by in this particular query? If you aren't grouping by any column, we want this for all trips, we actually don't even need the group by. We can skip straight to the aggregate functions. And so what this is going to do, if we're looking at our table, it's going to get this tip amount here, and it's going to just get this, it's going to pull up this column, and then just like if you were in Excel, it's going to average the column, give me that amount. Sum it, give me that amount, find the highest, find the lowest. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, so we're going to hit Control Enter. So we see on average, our tips are about $1.52. The total tips that we have recorded is a lot. Looks like $419 million in tips. with the highest tip amount being $999.99 and the minimum tip amount being minus $500 almost. So this number here is surprising. And as we're moving forward with our analysis, we might want to keep in mind that there's negative tips and that might be bad data. Maybe it's a refund. I'm not exactly sure. Okay, so let's go ahead and comment this out. So this was just our warm-up. The next thing we want to do is we want to find these same columns here, but we want it by vendor ID. Okay? Whenever you see by in the question, I want to know this by blah. That is what you're going to group by. Okay? So I'm going to move this guy down, and I'm going to put vendor ID up here. And as soon as I do that, I get this error, and it says select list expression reference column vendor ID, which is neither grouped nor aggregated. So if you remember, whenever we're doing group by, everyone has a role at the party. You're either being aggregated or you're being grouped. So since all of these tip amounts are being aggregated, vendor ID, he also needs to be aggregated, or we're going to have to group by him. So we're going to do group by vendor ID. And I'll put in here, you could also put group by one, either way. And so we have two vendor IDs. So what we're expecting to happen is we're going to have an additional column here. It's going to be called vendor ID. There will be a 1, there'll be a 2, and then these average trips, total tips, max tips, it's going to get split between the two of them. So let's see. So we see here with the total tips, this number before it was about 400 million, and now it looks like it's almost split exactly down the middle between vendor 1 and vendor 2. We see with vendor 1, the average tip is $1.51. The total tip is about half of the total pie. They have a max tip of, it looks like $1,000, and then their minimum tip is 0, which is good. That seems normal. For vendor ID 2, we see a similar number in terms of the average tips. So it doesn't seem like there's really any difference in how people are tipping between vendor 1 and vendor 2. The total tip amount is very similar. So that means that vendor 1 and vendor 2, they share this pie pretty equally. Even though the average here is very similar, there is a difference in the maximum tip that we see. Someone for vendor 1, they tipped $999, but the most that we saw for vendor 2 was $501. And then we also see that this minimum tip number, it seems to be something associated with vendor ID 2. So when we're doing our analysis, we might want to look and see, does vendor ID 2 have a lot of negative tips, or is it just this one entry that was maybe some bad data? Okay. So just to remind you what we did, the question was, we want to find the tips amounts, average, total, max, and min for all the trips in the data by vendor ID. So what we did is we used our first query where we had our average, our sum, our max, our min, and then we added in this column vendor ID. And so what vendor ID does is now it splits this up and it assigns one for each row. And then we did our group by vendor ID. Okay? So our next question is to find all trips, but only in the month of February. Easy enough. We're just going to do our copy paste again. So since we want all trips and we don't want it broken out by vendor ID or date or anything like that, we don't have to put in that vendor ID column or the group by. What we do need is we need to add in a where statement though. So we want where, and we're going to do one of our date functions that we learned in the previous module. We'll use the pickup date time. We're going to do extract month from pickup date time equals 2. Okay, so now I can run it. So we see in February, the maximum tip amount was 200, the minimum tip was 0, total tips was about 19 million, and then the average tip is a little bit lower than we saw from our entire sample. Instead of $1.50, it's $1.47. You might be wondering, how can I confirm that this is showing February? Because I'm not seeing anything that indicates that. I only have this where statement, and I'm hoping this extract month from date time equals 2 is what I want it to be. So what we can do is we can just copy this right here. We can add it right up in the front. And we'll call this as month. Now that I've added an additional column up here, he needs to either be grouped or he needs to be aggregated. Since we're not aggregating our months, we're going to group it by. So we're going to do group by 1. Voila. Now we see that the month is 2, which represents February. So in month 2, our average tips was $1.47, the max 200, the minimum 0. And we could do this too. Suppose we wanted to see what was the averages for the second day of each month. Let's say day equals 2. So what happened here is I said extract day from pickup date time where it's equal to 2. So this is only filtering for the second day, but I'm having group by month. So that's why I see here, now I see there's 12 months. And so what we just did is we said for month 1 for day 2, so for January 2nd, what were the average tips, total tips, max and min? For April 2nd, same question. March 2nd, October 2nd, July 2nd, all the way down. If I didn't want to break this down by month, I wanted to break it down by day. I could change this to day. And let's see. And here we go. So for day 2, what this just did is before we saw it by month, we saw what was the average amount for each month. Now it just averaged down across all of those rows. And so we see our average tip is 1.52, and then the total tips, max tip, and then the min tip. We could also add in another column. Maybe we wanted to do vendor ID. And if we do this, we get this error again. And that's because we have day, which is being grouped, and we have all of these guys, which are being aggregated, but vendor ID does not have an assignment in the party. So we're going to do group by 1, group by 2. So we see that day is repeated 2 times. That's because for vendor ID, we're looking at day 2, and for vendor ID 1, we're looking at day 2. And then this breaks out what were the tips, the min, and the max for each of them. And we're starting to see a trend here with vendor ID 2, where the minimum tips can be negative. Whereas for vendor ID 1, we have not seen that happen. Okay, so let's go to the last example. We want to find all trips for each day in March. Okay, simple enough. So instead of extract day, I'm going to do date of pickup date time as date. Dates. I'm going to add, so you see I left it as date and it turned blue. That's because this date is actually a keyword, and you don't really want to name your columns a keyword. So we're going to call it dates. And then we're going to extract where the month from our date time equals 3. And we're going to group by 1. And then I'm going to add in an order by so that my dates show up in the right order. Okay, so now we see in our dates column, we have each day of March, 1 all the way through to 31. And then we have the average tip amount, the total tip amount for that day, the highest and the lowest. So if we wanted and we said, you know what, I want to break this out not just by the day, but the day and the vendor, we can do that just like we did before. We add vendor ID, and now we have to assign him a role. We're going to do group by 1 and 2, so group by dates and vendor ID. And we're going to order by date, and let's see. Okay, so now we see each date is listed 2 times. 1 time for vendor ID 1, 1 time for vendor ID 2. So instead of having 31 rows, we should have 62. And when we look at our results page, we see we're showing 1 of 50 rows out of 62. And the 62 comes from because we have 31 days for March for vendor ID 1 and 31 days in March for vendor ID 2.